Well, Brexit is dominating pretty much everything in politics now, but not so long ago it was the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Britain's engagement in Afghanistan, in particular in the wake of 9/11, became the country's longest conflict since the Second World War. And in spite of over a decade of fighting and the loss of hundreds of lives, more than 400 Britons were killed there, the Americans are still unable to withdraw. And this week, the US Defence Secretary James Mattis announced he was sending a further 3,000 troops to support Afghan forces. Well, Professor Theo Farrell has written a detailed study of Britain's latest war in Afghanistan. It is entitled Unwinnable, Britain's War in Afghanistan. He's with me now. Welcome to you indeed. I'll just say to you, this is kind of the unofficial Chilcot report into Afghanistan.
Hopefully it's a bit shorter than Chilcot, but it does try and attempt to be very thorough and offer a very critical look at this war, which didn't turn out so well for Britain.
Now, of course, this war started after the attacks on 9/11 when al-Qaeda were based in Afghanistan under sitting alongside the Taliban government. Was there really, do you think, any political alternative but to going into Afghanistan and trying to oust the government and al-Qaeda?
No, there wasn't actually. At that stage, al-Qaeda had formed very close relations with the Taliban, and the Taliban weren't prepared to give up Mullah Omar, the leader of al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda. So it was necessary to go to war. The problem was what happened afterwards. And so by 2002, the Taliban had been overthrown, al-Qaeda had been turfed out of Afghanistan, and it would have been a good opportunity for Britain to extract itself, and instead it doubled down.
But, wasn't that breaking, what Colin Powell said, the rule of the crockery barn? In other words, we'd gone in there, we'd smashed their system. Didn't we have an obligation to try and reconstruct it?
And that was certainly the view of the British Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, who, as you may recall, brought enormous missionary zeal to British foreign policy at the time. He wanted Britain to be a force for good in the world. And so he was quite clear that Britain had an obligation to stay and help rebuild Afghanistan. The problem was it was just a massively ambitious project that he was taking on. And Britain wasn't able or prepared to commit the kind of resources that would have been necessary.
I mean, there is one sort of common version. He said, well, the problem was we got distracted by Iraq in 2003, went for Iraq, and basically just didn't concentrate on rebuilding Afghanistan. And if we had done, it might have been better.
I think that's true for the Americans. And we know within a couple of months after 9/11, the American military was focusing on Iraq and was trying to withdraw forces, actually, from Afghanistan for the anticipated fight in Iraq. And so the Afghan mission was handed over to the Europeans. And that's one of the reasons, again, why Britain was at the forefront of that effort, because the Americans were quite happy to hand it over to Britain. But the fact is, Afghanistan was an immensely complicated situation. And fundamentally, the problem actually was less the resilience of the Taliban insurgency, and was more the weakness and corruption of Afghan government.
And, once Iraq had been done, the tension sort of swept back to Afghanistan. That's when Britain's military involvement really multiplied. And you're saying that was pretty disastrous.
Yes, and it's very interesting because what happened is, of course, Britain commits a series of task forces into southern Afghanistan in a province called Helmand, which, of course, has dominated British press for many years, but is really a backwater. I mean, we literally deployed into a backwater, and the Taliban followed us in, and we ended up engaged in a very vicious insurgency. And the point is that when we went into Helmand, we knew hardly anything about the place. All we knew, successive advance parties came back to Whitehall and said, we know very little, but we think it's going to be, a very challenging mission.
But did we overreach? Did we, not have enough well-equipped troops there to do even the mission that we'd embarked on?
Initially we did, because the British Army was stuck in Iraq and couldn't extract itself from Iraq in the time frame it anticipated to go into Helmand in 2006. Over time, British forces ramp up, so the task force sizes increased from the first task force of 3,000 to eventually 10,000. And so eventually Britain puts a very capable task force into Helmand and is able to achieve stability. I mean, by the end, the British Army was pursuing a very successful counterinsurgency campaign. It did manage to stabilise and secure central Helmand.
But that didn't hold, though.
No, and that's the problem. The problem is they couldn't convert tactical success into strategic.
I mean, there is this sort of romantic vision that, just don't mess with Afghanistan. The Russians have tried it, and going back almost to Tamburlaine, the British was, I think, the fourth British-Afghan war.
Yes.
You just don't want to mess. They just leave them to it.
Is that right?
It's almost a rule of history, don't go to war in Afghanistan. And, it's known as the graveyard of empires, which is hyperbolic. But the fact is that it's an unusually challenging and harsh terrain politically, culturally, geographically. The local people don't particularly want Westerners wandering around with guns and are inclined to resist themselves with guns. And so it's a case that the British should have proceeded with more caution than they did.
Thank you. Well, Theo Farrell's book is published by Bodley Head and it's entitled Unwinnable. The weather now.
From warm